My name is Nechama Skolnick-Moskowitz, and I'm part of this Onward Hebrew initiative that has been moving across the country for the last 2.5 years with a lot of work that happened beforehand. Onward Hebrew, as I think all of you should know, is really about shifting and transforming the way we teach Hebrew and think about Hebrew learning in our synagogue and part-time educational settings. The 4 elements to Onward Hebrew as we talk about it. One is Hebrew through movement, so we get at the language. One is Jewish life vocabulary, so we infuse Hebrew words into our English. One is tefillah, so the kids get the sounds of Hebrew, and that really is the basis of all of this. It's moving from sound to print. And then I want to make sure that we're using similar language. We try really hard not to say delayed decoding. We're trying hard not to say waiting to teach decoding because nobody wants to be delayed or waiting, but that we're building a foundation of the sounds of Hebrew and then teaching the decoding part at the appropriate time. As I was in conversation with both Stacy and Nicki as we were planning this, one of the hypotheses is that the intentionality about tefillah has really increased since Onward Hebrew has come on the scene, where people are thinking a lot more about it and really being planful about how they are making it happen. And more people certainly are doing it more regularly, although I don't have data that I can share back out with you. We have about an hour with 2 really wonderful colleagues and experts. They're both on the leadership team for Onward Hebrew. One is Rabbi Nicki Greninger, who's a director of the, I don't know everyone's formal nuanced title, but it's Temple Isaiah. It's called J-Quest, and that's in Lafayette, California. And Rabbi Stacy Rigler, who also, she was the first J-Quest, has a program called J-Quest, and she's at Knesset Israel in Philadelphia. We're going to hopefully have lots of time for you to not only listen, but to raise questions. We've saved time at the end for that. I hope you used your chat box. Those of you who may not be aware of what this is, if you take your mouse and float it down to the bottom, if you're on a computer, it says chat. You can click on that and then send messages to everybody. You could do secret messages to individuals, but we hope you'll share broadly. And our goal today is that we hope that we can help. I'm going to turn things over to Nicki and then Stacy, and we're off. Go for it.
Thanks, Nechama. So I do want to say 2 things just as we're getting started. One is that we want to encourage you later to ask questions, and you're welcome to also put them in the chat box. But I want to just acknowledge that when we planned this webinar, of course, none of us had any idea that we would be in the situation that we are in today. I know we're coming from all over. We're all in different cities and places and situations. But I will say I am in the Bay Area in California. We are in a shelter-in-place situation. We're all, in our homes. And all of us, I think, in different ways are now in this shift pivot mode of, okay, we're not meeting in person, and are we continuing learning, and what's that going to look like? And we also don't know how long this is going to be. Is it going to be weeks? Is it going to be months? Is it going to be 6 months? Are we going to go into next school year? I mean, God knows at this point. And so I just want to acknowledge that. We're not going to completely change everything about our plan for today. I still think this is a really important topic for us to be considering. And again, God willing, we are going to be back together in person with our people sometime soon. We don't know when that will be, but I hope that this will still be helpful, even though some of us might be in a different mindset at the moment in terms of just what's happening and what's happening tomorrow or next week. So Stacy, you wanted to add?
Yeah, I do want to add, as people are thinking about virtual meetings, one of the things that we know best as educators is to start with a goal in mind. And so what we're going to be doing today is really talking about the goal of tefillah. So you might actually bifurcate your thinking in terms of what is your goal for in-person tefillah, and if you're thinking about an online experience or a virtual experience, what would your goal be for that? But this question of goals is really the key to this work, and it works virtually as well as in person. So if you're having trouble focusing on the future and just the here and now, then think about if you are going to be creating a virtual experience, because you'll get the same thing out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was reviewing what we were planning to do today, I think most of it is actually quite relevant, whether you're talking about virtual or in person. But of course, some of these things might vary a little bit in terms of short-term planning and long-term planning. But hopefully these types of questions will be relevant regardless. So we're going to jump into this. So I want to start by sharing a little bit about how I got into this, and that will frame this beginning section. So when I was in rabbinical school at HUC, and I was in the education program, and I did a thesis on tefillah education. And I was working with my advisors were Rabbi Larry Hoffman and Rabbi Jan Katsu, and Larry Hoffman was very involved in understanding what was going on with synagogues and synagogue transformation, and Jan Katsu at the time was the head of, I think, the education department for the URJ. And so they directed me to congregations that were considered to have strong worship and strong education, to try to learn about, well, how do they educate for tefillah? And so I learned about some congregations that were kind of known to be strong in those areas, and I went and visited them. There were 3 different congregations around the country, and I did kind of a deep dive into them. I ended up writing that thesis, and then later on turned that into an article that was in the Journal of Jewish Education. So we're going to send you that article if you haven't seen it or read it before. We'll send it to you after this call. But the title of that article is Believing, Behaving, Belonging, Tefillah Education in the 21st Century. And the reason that I gave it that title was that when I studied these 3 different congregations, what I found was that one of the things that made them so strong was that they were really intentional about their goals. The goals were really aligned across all the different kind of stakeholders. When you talked to people about prayer and about education for tefillah, you would hear similar sorts of things, whether it was from parents or teachers or clergy or the educators. And so what I realized is that they each had different goals, but within an institution, they were really clear about their goals. So we wanted to start out our conversation today with a conversation about goals, and in particular, these 3 areas of believing, behaving, belonging. So some of you might have heard this before or even read that article, but if not, we wanted to assume that maybe you haven't and give a frame for it. So we'll start out before we actually get into each of these 3 things is to think about, if you were to think about the program that you run, what are the things that you currently prioritize? Like, what are your goals in your own tefillah education? And you can just put it in the chat box, because we just wanted to kind of get a sense of where are people coming at this from. You can use the language of believing, behaving, belonging, but you certainly don't have to. Just, what would be your first impulse as to what are your goals? So I'll wait a second while you type in. So I see prayer literacy, familiarity with the prayer service, competence and confidence in leading prayer, understanding the content, community, confidence when entering adult prayer spaces, community, comfort leading prayers in front of the congregation. We want students to be familiar with the prayers that all Jews say, understanding general meaning, connection to the words, how does it mean something to me, sacred dialogues with self, others, Jews around the world, and with God, how to pray, what prayer is, context for individual prayer, fun, finding personal connection, comfort leading and participating, meaning to me and how to share it with others. Okay. So you can feel free to keep adding in there. Here's another one about participating fully. You could take actually almost all of these comments and categorize them according to these 3 things. And so the 3 are believing, behaving, and belonging. And I'm just going to say a quick sentence or 2 about each of those, and then Stacy and I are each going to dive into what that might look like in a congregational setting. So believing is another way to think of it as kind of kavanah, is the connection to prayer in the sense of the meaning and the spiritual connection. So what do these prayers mean? How do I feel connected to the experience of prayer? How do I feel connected to God? Those are the sorts of questions that might be part of believing. Behaving is more about the, all of you who talked about prayer competency, being able to really, do prayer. You know the prayers, you can say them, you can participate in a service. It's the behavior aspect, maybe even the keva. But it's also things like knowing when to sit and stand, and the choreography, and the sort of behavior of prayer. How do I actually do this from a mechanical standpoint and a being part of the community standpoint? The belonging piece is a little bit more, some of you mentioned about community as kind of the main goal for you, and that's where belonging fits in. So in Hebrew, we might say kahila, what is that connection, and how is prayer an avenue to build connection and community? And that could be a different approach to thinking about your goals for prayer. We are cognizant that this webinar is in the lens of Onward Hebrew, and we are going to get to talking about how Hebrew is intersected with all of this, but we wanted to start with these broader goals. So I'm going to turn it over to Stacy. We're each going to give some examples of what this might look like in each of these three kind of goal categories.
So I run a joint Reform and Conservative Jewish education program. So I'm going to be sharing first from the Reform synagogues tefillah around believing, and then Nicki will share about her program, and then I'll share from the conservative synagogues around behaving. So for us in tefillah, as Nicki mentioned, the most important pieces are that kids are feeling a sense of kavanah and connection. At a typical tefillah on a Tuesday afternoon or a Sunday morning, our experience doesn't look like it would on a Friday night that you would see when you come to the synagogue. It really focuses on the kids and their ages and stages. So on a Sunday morning, it's a family experience where we might have a special blessing for parents and kids with a talit, just talking about what we're thankful for each other. On our Sunday 3rd to 5th grade service, our cantor does a lot of yoga, so she often incorporates yoga poses within the tefillah experience. She's not as concerned with which prayers we're saying. She often has a video of the week that complements one of the themes of the prayers. And on Tuesday afternoon, I often use a book called Stories We Pray. It's put out by Torah Ora, and that book has some origin stories around the prayers. So we pick a different prayer each week, and I tell a story that uses the first time the prayer was used. So for Ma'ariv Aravim, it's about the sun going down and Adam and Eve wondering where the God of the sun was and where the God of the moon was. And then, no, it's actually one God who sustains us all. I'm thinking about this as I thought about what we did this Sunday morning virtually. So our virtual experience this Sunday morning did not feature any words in front of the kids. We weren't worried about whether they knew the words. It featured some singing. We began with some communal singing that they knew, and then opportunities to share what were they thankful for, what did they see that God created, what did the world need right now. Very concerned with how the kids are internalizing the Hebrew words and making sure that what they're feeling is connected to what we're saying.
So before I move on to the next piece, I want to give you a chance to just respond quickly in the chat box. In this category of believing, this idea of connecting to the prayers and the meaning of the prayers, Stacy gave some examples of what that might look like in her synagogue. But do you have other ideas of things that either you do or you could do or you've seen or heard? Like, what would it look like in, if the goal is really around believing, is around that kavanah? If you have other ideas, just put them up in the chat box and I'll read them out loud.
As people are writing, I'll also share for our B'nai Mitzvah, they actually take photographs related to each prayer and then create their own tefillah PowerPoint presentation. So another example of how we do that.
Somebody asked you, Stacy, how do you make sure they, quote, internalize the words? What does that mean?
So I think that we know that they are hearing the words. We're encouraging them to participate in the communal recitation. And we know that they're coming twice a week for many years. So they are hearing what the prayers mean. Later, I'll talk about what else we do in our curriculum. I think the question begs the point of you can't ever know what somebody internalizes, but we do know what we're sharing out.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay, somebody had said, Leslie said, we taught our students to sign the Shema. Are there other things? Some places do like a prayer journal, or trying to think of some other. You'll read in the article that I wrote. You can read a little bit more. But there was a congregation that did. They did actually a teacher tefillah every day, but it wasn't tefillah in like the keva sense. It wasn't those prayers. It was more like a meditation or kind of a centering of oneself, and that sort of led into then how the teachers would lead with their kids. Here, Diana said students write their own versions of tefillot. They might make artwork. So these are all great examples of what that believing goal might look like in terms of practice. Students add their own gratitude statements for Nisim B'chol Yom, absolutely. Okay, so I'm going to move into briefly about in my congregation. So in my congregation, I work at Temple Isaiah in Lafayette, California. I'm the director of lifelong learning, Nahama. So the real emphasis in my community is about belonging. We are a Reform congregation. We're a pretty large synagogue. We have about 375 kids in our education program that I run, JQuest. And the vast majority of the kids are not in school, in their regular schools, with other Jewish kids. Jews in the Bay Area are really spread out, and there's not really any physical Jewish neighborhood in our area. So our synagogue's tagline is, "Welcome to your Jewish neighborhood," because in your neighborhood, you might be one of the only Jewish kids. And so when you come to Temple Isaiah, we want them to really feel that sense of Jewish community and connection. And so I would say that's the goal for really everything that we do. But definitely in Tefillah, this is the main priority. And so some of what does that look like? Some of them are, to me, kind of obvious, but we end our weekday tefillah with singing Hashkivenu, with putting our arms around each other, not in the coronavirus stage, but typically that's something we do. During tefillah, we might do a pair share where I'll ask a question about something, and then they'll turn to a neighbor and discuss it. So that could be more in the believing category in terms of, reflecting on a prayer or what it means. But our purpose of doing that is to build community so that they have those conversations with each other. We also do, it's really important to us that we align the melodies and customs to our congregation. So unlike what Stacy was saying, where their prayer experience for their kids might be very different from their synagogue, we actually really try to keep it quite similar, similar melodies, similar customs. For example, we always do Mourner's Kaddish in JQuest Tefillah, and we ask for names exactly the same way that we do with our adults, both for the continuity and feeling connected to the larger community, but also when kids or even teachers share the names of people they're thinking of, that builds community because we're learning about each other and we're there for each other. We also sometimes do Misha Beirach for the same reason. So those are just some of the examples of how we are trying to build community through prayer. So I'm like we did before, if you want to take a minute and think about, if the goal is belonging, what else could you do, or do you do, or could you imagine doing to kind of work toward that goal in tefillah education? You can put that up in the chat box.
As people are posting, I would also say that a lot of the innovations that have been made in areas of inclusion and special needs kids fall into this category. People, not that you can't be inclusive in the other categories, but the people that were doing it first are most focused on making sure that everybody was part of their community.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Any ideas? I haven't seen any up in the chat box yet of something that would be really oriented towards community building. Monthly Shabbat services where kids participate in leadership. So that is one way to build community. What I'm thinking about here is in a prayer experience that's in your school setting, which might be on Shabbat, I'm not sure, but what would you do in the context of that service that could build community? So it might be leadership, being able to be a leader is one way to, of course, be connected to community. Students and their parents take turns giving a mini Devar Torah, so that could be. Focus check-in at the beginning for our small weekday group. Yeah, so if you're doing prayer in a small enough group where you could do some sort of check-in, that could be a way to begin a prayer experience. divided the students into 4 houses to build relationships. So you do specific activities during tefillah, I assume within those houses. A buddy system with younger and older students, absolutely. Created tefillah teams, older and younger students are grouped together. So all of the mixed age stuff that is coming up, I think are great things to be thinking about. There are ways of building community across ages there. Another thing that I didn't mention yet, but is also worth saying, is that thinking about seating is, I think, very important in tefillah, who sits where, and being intentional about that. And when it says we have 400 kids in a room, this is not always so easy. We also have 375 kids. We don't always do tefillah all together, though. We are intentional about sometimes being in separate groups by age and sometimes all together. But we do have specific seating that certain kids sit in certain places. So, for example, in our weekday tefillah, we have 3rd through 6th graders together in the room, but we have 3rd and 4th graders on one side and 5th and 6th graders on the other side. And actually, the 6th graders sit front and just to the right of me. I'm the leader, but they always sit in this front section. And I do that intentionally, both because 6th graders are the most likely to be goofing around and not wanting to be there. And so they're like right up in front, but also it kind of helps them be role models for the rest because they know they're right there and they have to kind of be on. And then we, halfway through the year, our 6th graders actually kind of move up and join our 7th graders in tefillah, and we seat them every other 6th, 7th grade, 6th, 7th grade for both communal connection. That way they get to know each other. It's also good for behavior management, but we think about that in terms of community building.
So I wanted to add, as people are thinking about the virtual versus in person, a community that is focused on belonging is going to choose a virtual experience where people can connect to each other. Mm-hmm. So whether that's on Facebook Live, where you can be typing in comments, or whether that's via Zoom, so that you're going to want to have that relational aspect. That's a key piece of this type of tefillah.
Right. So instead of recording something that just gets sent out, it would be important. Like we did this yesterday or 2 days ago. We did a tefillah that was on Zoom just like this, and we could see each other. And then I also, like Stacy did at the beginning, I said hi to individual people by their names, and there was a way to connect. Okay, Stacy, do you want to go on to the next piece?
Absolutely. So the last category is behaving. I'm going to talk about a conservative setting, but I've certainly been a part of reform settings where the role of religious school tefillah is focused on behaving. I kind of dub this like the learner's minion version. The goal in the conservative setting that I worked in for tefillah, or that I currently work in, is really about competence and confidence in the davening. So the service doesn't look the same as a Saturday morning service. It's definitely abbreviated, but there are core pieces of the service that are part of what the congregation is expected to be able to do. So things like chanting all of Ashrei, which isn't maybe every 2nd grader's most engaging activity, but it is a big part of being part of those congregational settings. The 5th graders learn how to read Torah, and then they read Torah in front of the entire community. It's about understanding and sort of having the prayer stamina to be part of the service. The kids are always holding prayer books, and they're holding the prayer books of their congregation so that they can find the prayers and they can follow along. They are also taking turns leading so that they have that ability to be a shliach tzipor. In those congregations, it's not usually the rabbi or the cantor that's leading, it's usually somebody else. And so the opportunity for the kids to lead alongside the other leaders is really important. In thinking about taking this to a virtual setting, you would always have the text in front of you, whether that would be sent out in advance or not, because there's a lot of text. It's not going to be easily known by memory. And it might be just a leader, but the kids would be encouraged to sing along. The rabbi just this morning was talking about that she was worried the kids were going to forget everything that they had learned because there's a lot of content to learn in the behaving style. And it really creates kids that are able to fully participate. Another discussion that is prominent is which nusach. Do you learn the weekday nusach or do you learn the Shabbat nusach? Are most of the kids going to a camp that they know the weekday nusach, or the Shabbat Nusach, and how can you supplement that to really know that they have that full experience.
So a lot of you talked about in your goals things that would fall under this category about competence and confidence, and I want them to know the prayers, and I want them to be able to participate in a synagogue wherever they go. So I think that on the one hand, it's probably fair to say that we all have all these goals for our students. But on the other hand, what I was noticing when I studied these congregations and what I've written about and tried to teach about is that when you try to do everything, it's really hard to do any of it very well. And so we are actually better when we are cognizant of the priorities that we have and the choices that we make in terms of what's a higher priority, because we really cannot do it all, and we can't do it all well, I'll put it that way. And so we have to make choices, and it's okay to make certain choices that are going to prioritize one thing a little bit more than another, which is true in the long term, but also even in this short term and in our virtual state at the moment.
I'm also going to add, and Nicki, I was going to speak to this a little later, that when you have multiple goals, it's hard for those goals to transmit to the kids because it's not just the prayer leader who is holding this experience. Whether it's a partnership between the clergy, the prayer leaders, who are sometimes the clergy, the educator, and the teachers, as well as the kids. And so those clear goals are going to be important for it to land properly.
Yeah. We'll come back to all of this in a little bit, but we wanted to shift for a few minutes. I think Stacy is going to talk a little bit about the intersection with Hebrew in all of this, and how do we think about the Hebrew learning and the Hebrew intersecting with whatever our tefillah goals are.
So in a little bit, I'm going to talk about how we got to where we are, but this is part of Onward Hebrew. And so we want to make sure, as you are thinking about your Hebrew, whichever category your goals fit in, that the tefillah is a Hebrew-rich experience. That doesn't mean you need to use only Hebrew in your tefillah, but there are lots of ways that you can incorporate things that you're already doing or you might be thinking of doing. So a very simple example is if you're using Hebrew through movement, when you ask the kids to stand and sit, you should be saying lakum and lashevet. When you dismiss them, you can say lalachet lakita. The type of instructions, they don't have to be many. And for me, even though I knew it, I had to write it right on my sheet because I kept forgetting it. The types of instructions that you're giving the kids can be done in Hebrew and can be aligned with Hebrew through movement. If you have Jewish life vocabulary, some of those words may be words that regularly appear in tefillah, maybe something like ahava, where you can point it out if that fits with your style of tefillah. Or there might be communal words, toda rabah, yesher koach, bavakasha, where you are saying and communicating using the Jewish life vocabulary that you want to be teaching. So you want to think about other places where you're using Hebrew and how that aligns with your tefillah experience.
You want to keep going?
Yes. So I'm going to take a little step back and talk to you about how we got to where we are, since we know that people on this call are in all different stages of Onward Hebrew. So for us, I would say maybe 8 years ago, our program was a more traditional religious school where we had 45 minutes of Judaica, 45 minutes of Hebrew, and a once a month tefillah or community time experience on a Sunday morning, and those things happened on Sundays and Tuesdays. So after meeting Nechama and drinking some Onward Hebrew Kool-Aid, even though it wasn't named Onward Hebrew at that time, we really looked at how we wanted to move to a sound-to-print methodology. We realized that we were exposing our kids to letters long before the Hebrew sounds. And so when we did this, we were able to do a multiple strand. You don't have to introduce everything at once by any means. But what we were able to do is from kindergarten to 6th grade, we implemented tefillah every time the kids met. We thought it was really important. So much of our community's goals were on competence and confidence in Hebrew. We really wanted people to know the prayers, to have them live in their hearts, and to feel comfortable in the synagogue and the sanctuary. And so we did it by age group. We divided up different ages, and we continue to change that. But every time we meet, we have a tefillah experience. In addition, we introduced Hebrew through movement. At the time, we introduced it kindergarten to 6th grade. Now we do it kindergarten to 4th grade, so that as our kids learn more in Hebrew through movement, they're able to use more Hebrew in tefillah. And as I said, we just talked about Jewish life vocabulary. We then, over a period of years, started introducing decoding in 4th or 5th grade. It's a majority of 5th grade at this point. So what that brought up, and I think Nicki's going to touch upon this also, is we started everywhere using transliteration as well as Hebrew, and highlighting things that were written in Hebrew. So similar to the way that younger elementary and preschool classrooms, we had a very Hebrew-rich environment where kids were wanting to see the Hebrew, wanting to learn Hebrew, and really excited about getting to do that once they had already had almost 5 years of hearing Hebrew through these different components. It's not the only way to do it, but that's how our program is set up.
Okay, I will. Okay.
Sorry, one other thing I want to add. A lot of people talk about if they have a midweek program, that they're not sure what to do in midweek if they take the decoding out. And that's not the focus of this webinar, but a big piece of what we do in 3rd and 4th grade is using the prayer strands, so that the information about what the prayers mean, that all takes place in tefillah, where it was previously taking place in our 45-minute Hebrew class. Sorry, go ahead, Nicki.
Oh, it's fine. So as we're thinking about how is tefillah one component of the Hebrew learning and how does it complement it, it's also probably important to think about who are the people that need to be involved in the conversations about what your goals are with Hebrew and prayer and what the prayer experience looks like. Again, I want to just say, I know this is all very hard when we're doing this virtually, but when there are opportunities to be in collaboration with others, that's really key. So I'll share for a moment about my own congregation and our story in terms of all of this Hebrew stuff, which is that about 2011, so 9 years ago, Nechama and Isa Aaron, this is at least the way I understand the story, is that both of them were kind of looking at their careers and getting towards maybe retirement and thinking, the one thing that really we need to address is Hebrew. This is like the elephant in the room that needs to be addressed. And so they pulled together a small group to convene and talk about how we could address the issue of Hebrew in Jewish education. And so I was invited to that, I think probably because of this article about tefillah education. So I left that meeting very excited about trying to rethink Hebrew. And I see there's like a whole side thing going on in the chat, so I'm going to leave that. I'll come back to it later. But so I was in this conversation about Hebrew, and what happened after that initial meeting is that it morphed into the B'nai Mitzvah revolution. It kind of went in that direction. But I was really jazzed about thinking about Hebrew. So I went back to my congregation and I launched a Hebrew task force. And that group had parents, probably 10 or so parents from our program. There were a couple of teachers who were part of the task force, our B'nai Mitzvah tutor, and then myself. And because I'm also a part of our clergy team, I was kind of representing our clergy team in that as well. And so we went through about a 2-year process in really rethinking what we were doing with Hebrew and how to do it differently. And so I say that because when you're thinking about tefillah and tefillah education and also how it intersects with Hebrew, this is one of those things that's right at the nexus of the overlap between different leaders, in particular clergy and educators, especially, of course, with the question of B'nai Mitzvah and Hebrew learning, but all of that is tied up also in prayer learning. And so one of the things that we wanted to be sure to touch on in this webinar is to be thinking about who is in the conversation about what your goals are and what the actual tefillah experience looks like. The other thing I'll say is that we do tefillah let me back up. Every time our students come to JQuest, we do tefillah. So if they come once a week, we do tefillah once a week. If they come twice a week, like because our 3rd through 7th graders come twice a week, then we do tefillah twice a week. Every time they come, we do it. Somebody asked about length. We also, it's either 20 or 30 minutes. For us, Sundays is 30 minutes. Weekdays is 20 minutes for half the year and 30 minutes for half the year. Long story why, but so in that range. But so that was always a part of our program. But as we were also rethinking Hebrew, we wanted to have tefillah be a part of that in terms of what we're doing. But as I said, the real emphasis in our community is about community building. So, but sometimes these things overlap. So for example, the educator who was there before me, during tefillah, she would often do a lot of holiday music with the kids. But we do have a song leader who also does music in the kids' classes separate from the communal tefillah. And I felt like the kids actually, their kind of ability from a keva standpoint wasn't so great. They didn't know a lot of prayers. So I really tried to increase doing the keva more often, because for us, that's a way of building community. If you know the prayers and can sing along, you're feeling connected to the community. And so it felt like that was something that we really needed to do. Julie is asking about how do we do this virtually. I'm going to pause on that because we have a Q&A towards the end. And if that's really where everyone's heads are, then we can definitely go there. But I wanted to share with you a document with some tips about tefillah education that come from me and Stacy. But before I do that, I mentioned about the question of who needs to be involved in conversations about goals with tefillah, but also I think at this moment, especially because of coronavirus, there's a question about timeline. So, you know, what are you thinking about now in terms of like what's going to happen in the next week or 2 weeks or this, you know, spring? But there's also a question about potentially for next year. So I think some of the things that we are encouraging everyone to think about is actually really good food for thought for next year and planning, you know, which is a little different than like what you're going to do next week. So we can go there as well. But to sort of be intentional about the timeline, like maybe these are seeds that you're planting for like, well, what are our long-term goals? And then who needs to be in the conversation about what tefillah should look like in our community in order to meet the goals that we've set. But that is kind of a longer term conversation. It's not something that happens overnight usually. Okay, so let me share this tips document. I'm gonna share the link. Yeah.
As Nicki's sharing the document, I really want to echo what she said. Tefillah goes across multiple lenses. And while we are all interested in providing virtual opportunities, before you start, making sure that you have all of your stakeholders aligned in your goals is going to be really important. In some ways, even more important if we think that what we're doing virtually is going to be replicated for several weeks or several months. That will save you a lot of time and very challenging conversations later on. It's really hard after the fact to approach somebody who's leading tefillah in a vision that's not yours and say, what you're doing, it doesn't fit if you don't have this goals document in front of you or predetermined.
Yeah. So I'm going to take just maybe 5 minutes or so now to go through this tips document and share some of the highlights from it. And then by about quarter till, we'll move more to a Q&A. And if there's a lot of interest in focusing more on how do we do this virtually, we can certainly go there. We're all shifting quickly in our intentions these days. But anyway, so on this tips document, hopefully, did everyone get it or they can open it? Yes? Okay. So
I'm sorry, before you start, just be aware that the link that Nicki sent is an editable link. So try not to get in and edit it. When I send you stuff afterwards, I'll send you one that lets you take it cleanly.
Oh, I thought I had set that differently to just view. Sorry about that.
I think it is just view because I see a button that says request edit access.
Oh,
so I
okay. I will, there was a request to share my screen, so I'm going to do that right now anyway. Okay, so here is this document. We'll send it to you afterwards as well. So hopefully you're all now tired of hearing me and Stacy say, be intentional about your goals. But that is definitely a really high priority, we both think, in terms of being successful in tefillah education. We're going to send out the article that I referenced so you can read that too. But to really consider, is your emphasis here on believing, behaving, or belonging? Another way of thinking about goals is know, do, feel. Are we focusing more on kind of knowledge, more on the doing, the actual, the action, or is it around feeling? But either way, remember, you cannot do it all. We don't have enough time, and it's just not possible to do it all. So you have to really think about what you prioritize and value. There's a couple of philosophical things. I really believe it's important to teach to the community's practice and minhag. So if your community, sits or stands for a certain prayer, your education program should probably do it the same way. We use the same siddur, like we use Mishkan Tefillah in my synagogue, so that's what we use with the students. I'll get more to siddur in a minute. Every person can be a prayer, including teachers and madrichim. This is a little pet peeve of mine. In a lot of synagogues, the teachers stand around the outside like they're like the jail guards, while the students are praying. And their job is to like shush everybody. But the more that the teachers and the madrichim can be part of the prayer experience, then it really is a prayer experience because they're praying too.
Nicki,
Also,
jump in for 1 second.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how clearly this is written, but I know it's something Nicki and I both feel really strongly about. Similar to Hebrew Through Movement, for those of you that have participated in it, where it's supposed to be a happy experience, tefillah in a religious school setting should be joyful. We want positive memories and associations. And while that may not be in everyone's goal, it's something that we think, if it doesn't feel good to you, figure out a way to make it feel more fulfilling, because that's going to translate to everybody else.
Right. And if the goal is around, developing belief, then you want that to be something also for teachers and for you and for, that it's, or if it's around community building, whatever the goals are, it should be that experience for everybody, not just the kids. Also, the more often you pray, the better at it you get. And what we mean here is that more is more. The more you do tefillah, the easier it gets. So the more often you do it, the more they'll learn. There's a whole bunch of things here about grouping and leadership. But just one thing to highlight is that, I jumped to the bottom here, but that really think about who is leading prayer. You may or may not have the ability to make that decision. It might already be decided in your congregation. It's a certain clergy person or whatever, but to really think about what that person's strengths are and how to kind of build together goals and also the strengths of the people leading. And maybe certain people are better at storytelling than others, or some people are better at tefillah with older or younger kids, but really thinking through that. Last thing about the siddur is that we both Stacy and I feel pretty strongly that transliteration is a tool for learning prayers. There's a great blog post by Joel Hoffman that's called The Use of Transliteration in the Synagogue. If you just Google transliteration Hebrew Joel Hoffman, you will find it. It's online, or we can link to it in the chat box. But basically, the point is that most non-Orthodox synagogues today have prayer books in the pews that have transliteration in them. It's just a tool for people that don't read Hebrew to be able to participate. And that for kids who are learning to be able to pray, it's very hard to learn by following along only in the Hebrew, because when you're a new Hebrew reader, it's hard to do that fast enough for synagogue speed to really participate. It's actually easier to know it in your ears and in your heart, and then really learn the reading skill. It's sort of like when you learn how to read Goodnight Moon, but you've already kind of know the story, and kids start to read it by pretending to read it, and then they actually read it. That kind of method also works. So that is something to think about.
I just want to add, if your heart skipped a beat over the thought of kids in religious school using transliteration, just let it sit with you. Nicki and I did not agree on this a few years ago. It took me a little while. Nicki's very good at persuading, and she's very smart. But this whole webinar, especially where we are today, see what resonates with you. See what you're feeling like, oh, I could start with this, either when I return to an in-person gathering or something virtual. If something's sticking with you, especially around transliteration, it's okay. Just put it to the side and it'll come back and you'll revisit it.
So it's already a quarter till. Time kind of flies in this sort of thing. We wanted to make sure to leave some time for Q&A. And I know that people have topped, I'm just trying to read the chat here, The Art of Gathering, the best type of guidebook for this kind of work. Thank you. Somebody earlier asked about what can we do thinking about this virtually. And I think all of this is really relevant, thinking through your goals, even if in this moment you can't collaborate with others, but you're just thinking, my goal in this moment is to just have a connection with community. Then thinking about what that looks like in a prayer context might be a little different than if you're just trying to make sure they know all the words to, Ve'ahavta. So how might that community bonding look in a virtual sense? Maybe it's seeing everybody, maybe it's calling out people's names, or even doing little breakout rooms for a short chat or something. If the goal is more of that kavanah, it might be doing a virtual tefillah where you're going to pose certain questions for thinking about certain prayers and what it means, or how we connect to it in this time that we're sitting in our house. Or, if that keva piece is really important and making sure they really keep up with their prayer knowledge in terms of the vocabulary and being able to daven, then maybe it's just, multiple times a week getting on some sort of virtual platform and doing a davening experience, and really making sure they have the words in front of them. So whatever it is, I think it's the goals piece is still really important. So we can, I don't know, Nechama, do you want people to raise hands or ask on the chat box, or how do you want to do Q&A?
I don't know. We can try hands. I have to switch my view. Hold on. Except I'm blocked.
I do also want to say, as people are thinking about virtual tefillahs, for those of you that are members of Reform congregations, the URJ did a webinar yesterday, today, and tomorrow, both talking about services and virtual meetings and the technical aspects as well as the leader aspects. And they should be available if you're that's like a whole other, how to do that is a whole other learning journey.
We'll take any questions about tefillah education, about how it intersects with Hebrew learning. If you want to talk more specifically about this virtual moment we're in, we can do that, or just more broadly, any of the things we've brought up, or tips or anything.
So unmute yourself if you want to say something.
Raya, I think is your name. You're raising your hand. Go for it.
I'm a newcomer to this webliner. I was invited by Julie because we work together, and she was implementing everything that you're doing and saying right now in our tefillah sessions. I was a little bit against it because I didn't like transliteration. But you convinced me that we should. And well, depending on the rabbi as well. Now I need to know, how do I continue visiting your site, and can I be invited?
So I think you're asking about Onward Hebrew. Is that what you're asking about in this work? So there's a Facebook group. If you're on Facebook, you can join there. There's also a website, onwardhebrew.org, I believe.
Okay.
That has lots of videos and resources. And so those are the two best ways to connect right now.
Thank you. That's all I wanted to know.
Yeah. Other questions or challenges people are having or thinking about? I know it's hard. Yes, Diana.
It's interesting to hear you say that if I'm understanding correctly, there should really be one unified goal through, like, across clergy, education, and so on. And I think, well, I'm the chazan, and I teach tefillah to the kids on Sundays, and like I said earlier, my real primary goal, I would say, is kavanah, and believing in that depth of understanding. And I think our lifelong learning director that I work with and under, I think her focus is more keva, and so we're really trying to work together with that. I wonder if you have any suggestions about how to reconcile, like, if there are two really strong visions.
So
Great question.
I want to emphasize that the vision is for the tefillah time. So the first thing I would encourage anyone to look at is, what's happening at other times around Hebrew and Tefillah, and what are the goals in those spaces? So for us, our 5th and 6th graders, we're focusing on correct pronunciation. So I'm not worried if in Tefillah there's a little, less than accurate pronunciation, because I know that's happening in a different space. So when you have multiple visions, one of the things I want to encourage you to do is look at your whole educational experience. And if kids come for a junior congregation or a monthly Shabbat experience, if you have a lot of camp kids, how are those things interplaying? If not, I also want to encourage you to get teachers and lay leaders involved, because your parents and your congregation have a vision for what they want for Jewish education, and your teachers have a vision for why they're teaching. And it should really be a communal conversation of what are the key goals, and then how are we teaching to those goals.
Yeah, I want to echo the second part that Stacy said about broadening the conversation, not so that it's sort of this war where it's like, whose side is everybody going to take? Not like that, but more to better understand the community's priorities. So I would say, like, your lay leaders, if there's an ed committee, if there's some sort of, parents that are kind of good representatives of the community. Now, the parents don't always have to make all the decisions, but I think it's helpful to know what this community values for themselves, which may or may not be aligned with your own personal feelings. So, for example, I came to Temple Isaiah in California, and if you had asked me my priority 12 years ago when I started here, I would not have created a program where belonging was the main focus. Like, that's not really actually where I am at as a prayer and as a educator. But it took me a year or two to really learn the community, but that is 100% what Temple Isaiah is all about. And if I came in with more of an agenda to we are going to focus on, one of the other things, I think I would have not been very successful in that community, because that's not their goals. Their goal is to connect and feel that sense of belonging. That's far and above the most important thing. Like I said, because of the geography and because people don't live near other Jews, and there's a whole history there about why that's really relevant for them, that they care so much more about that sense of belonging than whether their kid knows all the words to, Gevurot. So I do care about I also want to say, caring about prioritizing one doesn't mean throwing the others out with the trash. Obviously, I would say the kids in my community actually know prayers very, very well. But we still make choices with certain things in mind. And sometimes we sacrifice one thing for another because we recognize this is our goal more than this other thing. So I think having alignment across all those different stakeholders, not just the clergy or educator, is, just like Stacy said, as much as you can kind of broaden that conversation or listen for what do you hear people saying is important to them, not just the squeaky wheels,
I see Michelle's hand. I also want to add the kids, both current kids as well as maybe teenagers in your program or recent graduates, because their anecdotal narratives can be really helpful in shaping this conversation.
Yeah, that's true. Michelle, was that you with your hand up? Go for it.
Yeah. Hi. Sorry. I got so used to just sitting and writing. I feel like talking is weird. So this is for sure for another conversation, but one of the challenges that we face, and I'm at a congregation that's over 1,500 families, is that we don't have a good sense of what a junior congregation looks like. Since I've known this place, there really hasn't been one. And we have a new head of the school, and she's wonderful. But that's part of where our conversation is now, which is what does a monthly family Shabbat look like? How do we use what they're doing in religious school and translate that into a spiritual place on a Friday night, but still make it relatable to the kids and what they're learning. I mean, that's a whole other thing, but just how, and I'm assuming, one of the things I was thinking was well, where does the creation of that service mostly live? Does it live with clergy? Does it live with education? I'm assuming the answer is, of course, both.
What's your role, Michelle?
I'm a cantorial soloist.
Okay.
Like one of the, there's 5 clergy, so I'm one of the clergy.
Where are you? Where do you work?
I'm at Bethel in Boca Raton.
Okay. So, I mean, I think you're right. It's probably a whole other webinar is like about junior congregation or Shabbat services and how that interfaces with education programs. But I would say standing on one foot that, I mean, you kind of answered your own question. I think that the creation of the service should be in alignment with what's happening in the education program as much as possible, including the leadership of it. So for us, just as an example, we have a once a month service called Shabbat Arama. That's our like family service. And I am in charge of tefillah for JQuest for our education program. I am not in charge of Shabbat Arama. I work with a colleague, Rabbi Alyssa Miller. She runs Shabbat Arama. But the song leader for JQuest is also the person who is the song leader for Shabbat Arama. We have a cantor, but the Shabbat Arama service, our song leader is in charge of the music. And so his name is Ben. So Ben works with me in JQuest Tefillah, and he works with Alyssa in Shabbat Arama. And I think that overlap of kind of personnel is that he'll say, oh, well, this is a melody we've been doing a lot lately in JQuest, or here's a song I've been teaching the kids, let's include it this month. Or, and Alyssa and I also actually often help lead Shabbat Arama. So for example, if there's a certain song that we've been doing, we do a lot of like roll into dark and we have hand motions and whatever. So then at Shabbat Arama, I'm there and I lead the hand motions and we call some of the kids up to demonstrate how we do it in JQuest and then other families who are there. So I think it is like the synergy of that is important in both the personnel who's involved in leading those different tefillot experiences. And I would also just say, you mentioned something about how do we have that Shabbat thing be a spiritual experience. My goal is that JQuest Tefillah is always a spiritual, prayerful, like real prayer experience. So there's not so much of a difference actually in our community between JQuest Tefillah and Shabbat Arama, other than there's some Shabbat prayers we do Friday night that we don't do, like we might do, I don't know, whatever, Vishamru or something.
So
I'm going to need to cut this conversation.
That's okay.
Yeah, I guess it's the end. We'll have to wrap up.
Exactly. Sorry.
Thank you.
Sorry. I'm happy to talk more another time.
Yeah, I want to suggest, first of all, that if you're not on the Onward Hebrew Facebook group, that anyone who's on here, I don't know how you've learned about this otherwise, but you should be on the Onward Hebrew Facebook group. And Michelle, for instance, I invite you to post that question to the group because it fits a lot of what we're doing. And if there are any other questions that people have as a follow-up to this, that's a great place to do that also. I will be sending out to you when we're done, and it's just ready to hit click, Nicki's article, the link to the tips that she offered, and a feedback piece because we'd really like to get your feedback. There's only one question, which is just pick how helpful this was to you that's required, and the rest, if you want to answer, go for it. I want to thank Stacy and Nicki for their leadership and their thoughtfulness and their sharing with us everything that they've done. This was very interesting and helpful, and I think the questions and comments that came also added in. I made note as we were talking about, there were a couple things in the chat about Hebrew Through Movement. One, there's a Facebook group called Hebrew Moves Me, which is a good place to learn about it, as well as HebrewThroughMovement.org. And if I have a feeling that maybe it's time to do a general webinar just on Hebrew Through Movement for people who don't know, so I'll figure that out. And to let you know, I think Stacy was the one who mentioned something similar to this, but on April the 2nd, we are hopefully having a webinar. It'll be at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. The rest of you can figure out your times on if you end up moving decoding to a place after kids have this foundation in the sounds of Hebrew, then what does your program look like? And there are a couple of people who had posted on the Onward Hebrew Facebook group, and I said, are you willing to do a webinar? And they said yes. So they're hoping that the community will come together and add ideas in, but that's what we're planning on doing. So I thank you all very much, not only for being part of Onward Hebrew, but for everything that you're doing on behalf of your congregations and your kids and your families at this very difficult time. And we wish you well. Keep washing those hands and stay in touch.